Morning, Spencer.
Good morning, Richard.
Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Running a little short on time, so let's just jump straight into the case.
Fantastic.
Right, our client is an Atlanta-based healthcare company. They specialize in children's diseases. Recently, their IT department has flagged that they're running out of capacity, and they've been looking at moving to a cloud-based storage system. The company basically wants to know if this is a good idea, and if it is, how long it will take them to break even over their current system.
Excellent. Just to make sure I've understood the case, our client is considering outsourcing their IT to the cloud, and they were hoping to find out if this was a good idea or not, and if so, what the break-even would be.
Absolutely.
Give me a moment to collect my thoughts.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay. I'd like to take a look at the following things. I'd like to take a look at the current revenues generated by the IT, their fixed costs, their variable costs, and then what the net costs are for the current IT configuration. And then for cloud computing, I would also like to look at the same metrics. And in terms of calculating whether or not this is a good idea, I'd like to understand a little bit more about the regulations involved, any risks that might be involved with moving from insourcing to outsourcing, and what benefits might be accrued by either configuration.
Okay, great. Just to clarify, when you're looking at the difference between revenues and fixed costs, you're basically looking at the cost differential. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Let's do it.
Okay. What can you tell me about the current revenues generated by the IT system or their IT configuration?
Okay, so the IT system itself doesn't generate the revenue, but the company itself requires the IT system to generate revenue.
Would there be any difference between the revenue generating potential of either configuration?
Not potentially, no. So we're just looking at the current market, the current structure of the business will bring in revenue, and usually the IT requirements are mapped to that revenue directly of the company.
Okay. Let's take a look at their fixed costs.
Okay.
For the current configuration, what kind of fixed costs are involved?
Well, in order to do that, let's look at the current infrastructure that they have.
Okay.
So this is an exhibit basically showing the revenue growth that is projected for next year, 2009. What can you tell me about the requirements for their IT system over the coming year?
Well, first I need to know how many servers were needed to satisfy this revenue growth.
Okay.
Is there a given number of servers that are required for a certain volume of revenues?
Right, so we're going to need one server per state minimum, and then
Okay.
for every $300 million increment, we're going to need an additional server. So for example, if a state requires $200 million, they'll only need one server. If a state has $400 million projected growth, they'll need 2 servers.
Excellent. Would you mind if I write on this exhibit?
No, please.
I calculate that they will need 12 servers to satisfy 2009 revenues.
Okay, good.
And can you tell me a little bit about how much each server costs in terms of materials and labor to install, and then, of course, what kind of costs are involved with operating these servers every year?
Absolutely. So obviously these are going to be different provided which option that we go with. So as you outlined before, we either have an option to keep it in-house, we have an option to go outsource. Is there anything else that we might have to consider in doing either of these two things?
Well, as I mentioned before, regulations, risks, and benefits, but it depends on what kinds of services are provided by a cloud service provider. Are they going to pay for electricity, or is that going to be added on to the bill? Will you need to maintain staff in the IT department just to make sure the cloud system is up and running?
Yep.
And of course, how many staff will you be able to let go or repurpose by outsourcing to the cloud?
Okay, great. So let's look at some costs involved. As you can see that there are 2 potential vendors that we're considering. And as you mentioned, this is full-time staff that we'd have to keep on, an annual fee, his electricity, and things like that. So based on this information, where would you like to go?
Well, I would like to find out how much each full-time engineer cost.
Great. So each full-time engineer costs about $100,000 annually.
Okay. Do you mind if I write on this exhibit?
Again, no, that's fine.
How much does electricity cost per hour per server?
Per hour per server, electricity costs 5 cents. So maybe you could explain to me what you're trying to map out here.
I'm trying to calculate the overall cost in terms of variable costs and fixed costs for each one of these options.
Okay. So walk me through one of them.
Excellent. For self-implementation, for example, we know that the current configuration costs about $1.2 million for 2009 and then $1.5 million for 2010.
Mm-hmm.
Self-implementation, of course, would be cloud computing. You would have to install 12 servers. It looks like the cost for those servers would be $6,000.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, you're going to have a $5 million installation cost, which I assume would be setup, software, configuring the system. You're going to need, doing the math here, it looks like this is going to be somewhat insignificant, this cost for electricity. But your full-time engineers would add up to $1 million per year in annual fees,
Okay.
which is almost the entire cost that you have now. So I want to look at how long it might take to recoup the $5 million in your upfront initial investment if you're only going to save $200,000 the first year and $500,000 every year after that.
Okay. So you're basing, as I alluded to before, on this graph, it's going to be $1.2 million next year, $1.5 million the year after.
And according to this chart, every year after that.
Okay, great.
Okay, and I would like to look at the savings versus the initial costs for all of the options.
Okay,
Okay. Give me a moment to set this up, please.
sure.
Thank you.
So writing out 10 years. Sorry, go on. I'm just sort of
Correct.
for my own sake, so I can keep up. So you want to map out the savings difference between what it's currently costing us
Mm-hmm.
and each of these. So self-implementation first, you mentioned it was $200,000 for the first year difference?
Yes. I would assume that your energy consumption at 5 cents per hour per server, that's really talking about 60 cents per hour. Really not going to add up to anything significant considering you've got $1 million in engineering fees.
So the math there would just be 5 cents times 50.
Yes, it's not going to be anywhere near the difference of $100,000 per year that you have in salary costs.
Okay, well, let's just leave it then.
It just won't add up. So we're going to ignore the energy consumption. It's basically immaterial.
Okay.
Again, $2.5 per day per server. Again, that's going to be basically immaterial. Here you're talking about $24 per day. Here you're talking about $36 per day.